Hi there, I'm Trisha. Thank you for joining me at my YouTube channel. Today I thought I would not only show you how to create a fall watercolor wreath, but also how I created the card itself. Let's get started. First we're going to need this vine from the new foliage set, this flower from the garden wagon set, this small branch from the branches set, and this twig from the fall set. We're also going to need a piece of watercolor paper and a circle die to use as a template for our wreath, some markers, a paintbrush, and a pencil. We're going to start off by drawing a circle using the circle die. Then we're going to take a ruler and we're going to divide the circle into 4 quadrants. They don't have to be perfect, it's just a guideline. Make sure you don't draw too heavy with your pencil, as we're going to erase those lines later. So now that we have our quadrants, our first step is going to be to ink up our vine stamp. So using the number 43 yellow, brilliant yellow, I'm going to ink up just the top half of the stamp. And I'm going to stamp it right along the line for the first quadrant. And I'm going to use the stamp just like we normally do. We're going to stamp it 5 times or more, whatever we can get from that stamp before we re-ink it. Then we're going to continue and we're going to re-ink the stamp and stamp it in the next quadrant. We want to stamp them kind of in the same place because we're trying to get a really balanced look to our wreath. So we're going to do our best to stamp them pretty much in the same area each time. Now I've decided I needed a little more yellow, so I'm going to add a few more leaves to this wreath in the yellow, and then I'm going to move on to the orange. So next we're going to pick up our next color, which is the terracotta. And again, we're going to ink up just the bottom, just the top of the stamp, and I'm going to stamp it right underneath the yellow. So I'm going to stamp that 4 or 5 times, turn my paper, ink my stamp up again, and then stamp it again 4 or 5 times. So the process is pretty much the same as any other project we would do with watercolor. And again, I'm going to stamp it for the final time underneath the yellow. So what I'm going to do now is, because this process is pretty much the same, I'm going to speed up the video a little bit, and I'll tell you the colors that I'm going to use. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ink up the stamp in the English red, and I'm going to kind of put this between the yellow and the orange on the wreath. And notice I'm leaving some white space. That's because I want to make sure I have plenty of room for all of my elements. So I don't want to bunch them all up together and then have my elements kind of sitting in the middle. I really want it to look uniform and cohesive. So you see here, I'm actually wiping off my stamp. That's because I'm going to use green, and I just used red. So if I just went over it with the green, it would really create a muddy kind of a brown color, and I didn't really want that. So next I'm going to finish off the green, and then I'm going to pick up my next, which is the small twig, and I'm going to do half of that with brown and half of that with the red. Now this little twig here is two-tone. I'm only going to stamp it 3 times. I'm going to stamp it to the middle and then onto each side. Then I'm going to re-ink, I'm going to go to the next quadrant, and I'm going to stamp it 3 or 4 times. It doesn't need to be stamped too much, I just want the hint of those twigs and berries right there. So now I'm going to move on to this little flower here. So I'm going to ink up the base of it with the green and the flowers with a eggplant. And then I'm going to stamp it just a couple times, and I'm going to try to get it outside because I really want this wreath to get a little bit more full. So I'm starting to now go outside of that uniform look that we had before. So I'm just inking both of those colors up and then stamping it a couple of times. Now once I'm done with that, I'm going to pick up this small branch and I'm going to ink that up with the sepia. And I'm really just going to randomly stamp here and there 1 or 2 times before I re-ink it, because this is just going to give a little more interest to our wreath. Now it's time to add the water. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to add water to my yellow blooms, and then I'm going to move on to my orange, then the red, then the green. I'm doing this because I want my yellow to stay really yellow, and if you do the other colors first, you might muddy it up. So I'm really trying to keep my colors the way they were intended. So I'm first going to go in with the yellow. Now I'm softening up those orange blooms. Again, it's just like when we watercolor any other time. You want to leave some white space. You don't want to add too much water. And you really just want to touch those with the side of your brush. Touch those little leaves and soften them up. Now we're going to move on to the red. So remember, we're putting our brush in water. We're pinching off the excess water and adding the water to each of these little areas. You can always add the water as you go. I just chose to do the entire wreath and then come in and soften all of those lines up after the fact. So now I'm just adding the water to the green areas. And you can see as you're adding the water, it really makes this pop right out. Now when we do these little branches with the red berries, all I'm doing is touching the berries. I'm not really touching those branches too much. I'm touching them a very little bit, but I'm mostly trying to touch those red berries on the top to make them pop out. This is a really cool stamp set. The new fall stamp set is really cool. Now we're going to move on to those flowers. And what we're going to do is we're just going to touch those purple tops. We're not going to do anything with those stems. We're going to leave them just as they are. And we're just going to add a little bit of water to those flowers, just to bring the color out a little bit more. So we're going to add just a little bit more water to those. And then we are almost finished. I think I went in and I did soften a little bit of those small branches. It's not necessary. You don't have to do that. I just felt like I needed to. Now I'm just taking my kneaded eraser and I'm erasing all of my pencil lines. And you want to make sure your project is really dry before you start erasing anything. And just make sure that you really erase all of those lines really well. So I take my project and I put it into my MISTI, and I'm using the Thankful from the Gina K Designs Stitched Leaves Stamp Kit, and I'm inking that up with some Gina K Designs dark chocolate ink. Now I put it in my MISTI because when I work with watercolor paper, it's very porous, so you're going to need to stamp it a few times in order for you to get a really good impression. I think I did it 4 times. Then I added this I'm So and For You above and below it. So I took a piece of Gina K Designs Lemon Drop cardstock and I embossed it with these stitch line dies from Essentials by Ellen. I'm going to take that panel and I'm going to adhere my watercolor project to it, and then I'm going to adhere it to the front of this A2 cardstock, which is Gina K Designs dark chocolate cardstock. So now I'm putting some really strong adhesive on the back of my watercolor piece, and the reason I'm doing that is because watercolor paper tends to come off of your card base, so you really want to use a nice and strong adhesive to make sure that your project stays together after you send it in the mail. So I'm just taking the backing off of that, and I'll adhere it to the front of that yellow card base. Now I'm going to add some more of that strong adhesive to the back of the yellow panel before I adhere it to the dark chocolate cardstock. This again will just ensure that it stays in place in the mail and afterwards. So I'm taking off the backing to the adhesive and I'll line it up on the front of the dark chocolate card base. And that's it. I'm going to fold it over and use my bone folder just to create a nice edge and crease it. And that's it for the card. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.